Good morning, everyone. Today,
Hi.
we are very lucky to have Paula Lancaster with us. She is transitioning into a new position. She's now the dean at Central Michigan University, but she developed this practice opportunity with her colleague, Joe Fisher, at Grand Valley State University, where she was the former director of teacher education. And Paula's going to be talking about simulated interactions and specifically how to use a simulated interaction with explicit instruction. Paula?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Mary. And I just want to add to that lovely acknowledgement that, Joe and I both, and me in particular, are very grateful to the CEDAR team for all the support and feedback that you all have given us too. We know that it has made the activities and assignments and the work that we're doing even better. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to describe what we have called the simulated interactions. So I'll just start with a little bit about why simulated interactions, why use that term. So we think about this as a little bit different from a role play, although it has some similarities. But the purpose of a simulated interaction is to afford our teacher candidates the opportunities to practice critical components of specific HLPs. And then in the interactions, we have adults or their peers in this case who are posing, I should say posing instead of posting, but posing as students. So they're taking the role of students. And so in a simulated interaction, we would think about a high leverage practice in particular. Something that we know our teacher candidates really need to learn how to do and do very, very well. And we break that practice down into component parts or components that we know also our candidates might struggle to do a little bit. And so we purposefully try to lighten their cognitive load as they are taking up the practice and becoming much better at it. So we take a very developmental approach to them learning the practice itself and how to enact it. And a simulated interaction is one of the ways that we help them get to the point where they are effectively enacting a practice. So the way we limit the cognitive load is to incrementally develop their skillfulness. So over time, we add a few more layers, a few more textures to the work that they're doing with students. And then the complexity of the content grows also. But in this way, they're taking steps toward being able to enact the practice and being able to think about what's most important in the moments as they move along. We're also using the simulated interaction as a formative assessment tool. So there's considerable amount of feedback given at each step along the way. And so in the next slide, I'm going to kind of go through some of those steps, or what we refer to as phases. So as I said earlier,
Paula, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please do.
At what point are you introducing simulated interactions? Early on in their program, or is this something that you do later, right before they have their practicum or their student teaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. Early on. It's relatively early on. Most of the students, depending on what they come into the program having completed already, are taking this course the course that we start the simulated interactions in, late in their sophomore year, early in their junior year. But the course is followed by their first full-on practicum experience, not student teaching yet, but they have a pre-practicum experience prior to student teaching. And the course is followed by that experience. So they would likely have taken coursework already that introduced them to, in this case, explicit instruction in some way, but they would not have reached a level of mastery around explicit instruction yet. It's really just been talked about. Mm-hmm. Right. So then, as we've thought about their levels of practice with, in this case, explicit instruction. So that's the exemplar HLP that we'll use, explicit instruction in this case. They are enrolled in a course, and I'm using our elementary course as the example also. So we have a course that all of our students take that is focused mostly on inclusive instruction. We have a different elementary and secondary version of this. So in this particular case, we're talking about the elementary version of the course for our elementary majors. So they enroll in this course, and we begin the phases of the simulated interactions in that course. And this is where we really take a more deliberate approach, a more explicit approach into teaching explicit instruction. So they do see the faculty, the instructors model components of explicit instruction. And as we're modeling, we're naming exactly what it is that we're doing. They're introduced to kind of a visual representation of a model of explicit instruction. They also watch video of teachers teaching explicit instruction. So they should have a pretty good visual representation of what it is that we're looking for. But we also know from our past experience that that visual representation was not enough for them to translate really good explicit instruction with children. And so we knew we needed something to bridge that developmentally. And also we knew that where they struggled the most seemed to be with offering really strong, succinct, clear explanations, as well as really good, engaging models that incorporate a think aloud for the students. So in fact, the models, they really struggled to be able to do that. So that's where we focused our simulated interactions on that component, those components of explicit instruction. So you'll notice that on the slide, phase 1 and phase 2 happen within our university classroom. So it's a university-based classroom. We're on campus for about the first 5 weeks, depending on the calendar, 5 to 6 weeks, we'll say. And then we move into a school to take up phase 3 of the instruction. But within phase 1, what we've tried to do is get our candidates to practice explicit instruction and really just focus on explicit instruction. We don't want them to have to worry about the content, the accuracy of their content knowledge. We're just focusing on the practice. So we have them do some simulated interactions that are content neutral, content that they know and understand. And some examples of that we use are things like how to pack a lunch, how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, how to make a bed, how to prepare a bowl of cereal. It's as simple as that. They don't have to think about it, but what they really need to focus on is the explicit instruction. So they deliver these interactions content neutral and to their peers. So they're actually practicing with their peers. And then in phase 2, we introduce the content that they will eventually be teaching to children once we transition into the buildings. And that content depends in part on the relationships and the preferences of the school that's hosting us. Oh, Mary, I think you have a question. I can't hear it.
Yes, I think though the slides aren't advancing as you talk.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's on the first slide.
We're still on the first slide?
Yes.
Okay. So where are we? What do you see now?
Just the first slide.
Oh no, it's not advancing. Okay.
What?
So it's advancing on mine, but it's not advancing on yours.
Paula, sometimes if you stop sharing and then reshare again, it fixes it for some reason.
Let's try that.
See if it just resets it.
I did get a message at one point about some sharing issues. Does that look?
Yeah.
Is it advancing also?
So if you want to finish discuss, this is the slide about the phases.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So we're on phase 2, we introduce the content that students will eventually, that our candidates will eventually be teaching and working with children in the school that's hosting us. And the school districts generally decide with us what that content might be. So in the past, that has ranged from some very early literacy skills to numeracy skills, to, depending on, you know, the age range and the needs of the children in the classrooms, to strategy instruction, strategic instruction, particularly in the area of reading. And so we've done a number of, or taken up a number of different content areas, but we do have our candidates practice first with their peers on the content that they will be teaching. So they're, again, delivering explicit instruction focused primarily on a rich description and explanation, as well as modeling that's engaging and that includes good, solid examples and non-examples. So that's phase 2, content specific and practice with peers. And then we move into phase 3, which happens in the school building and with children. It's usually 2-on-1, which means 2 of our candidates working with 1 student, but sometimes it's 2-on-2 or 1-on-1, depending on how many children and things like absences and such. But in that case, then our candidates practice and they are supervised the entire time. So there's a faculty member with them the entire time, circulating and giving feedback and watching and observing. And then phase 4 is the practicum. Beth, did you have a question?
I did, sorry, I was muted. So is any of this ever videotaped so the student can go back, like maybe in phase 1 or when they're with their peers, do they do any video analysis of themselves?
We have started working with some video analysis, which we think is a really very, very good idea. And we also, as part of their program, just generally, we do ask them to video even before the course starts. They're asked to do a couple video clips of themselves, just delivering what they think is explicit instruction, so that we have some baseline and they can compare and improve over time. And then when they are in their practicum, they're required to video. Also. And that's the phase 4. So in phase 3, they're delivering the explicit instruction, the content instruction, but it's with either an individual child or a small group. But in phase 4, they would be expected to deliver small group instruction and possibly even a little bit larger group instruction as well. And then, you know, as I said earlier, we focus within the explicit instruction model. We're really focused on the explaining and modeling parts or components of explicit instruction. But the simulation, and I put some pictures of simulations on there because I think it's so important for us in education to continue to develop in the simulation work that we do. So many other professions use simulations as an excellent way to prepare their candidates or their professionals for the work that they're doing. But our simulation components consist of pretty explicit directions for the task and what our candidates are going to do and the expectations. We use the term scoring criteria, but scoring might be a little bit of a stretch. It really is more about the feedback that they get. We try to give them any information they might need about the content, again, so that we're lessening the cognitive load and really getting them to focus on the teaching that they're doing. They have some opportunities for guided planning. So we try not to leave their planning too open-ended and really give them very specific directions about what they should think about and consider. And then we also have a student profile for their peers who are going to be, you know, stepping in and acting as students. We give them some specific directions too. And so I've included a few slides. I'm not sure how visible these are going to be, but just to give you a sense for what those materials look like, you know, we have laid out exactly what the focus will be, what their task will be. The scoring criteria tells them exactly what we're going to be looking for. And then in this case, where they're asked to provide some explicit instruction on packing a lunch, we chose that topic because we were pretty sure that everyone would know how to do it. But we don't want them spending time trying to be creative about how to pack a lunch. That's not the point. The point is to practice explicit instruction. So we even included in here are the steps for packing a lunch that you're actually going to address. Don't worry about, you know, making those up. We've done that for you.
So Paula, do you give your students a specific lesson plan, or
In this stage, really what we're doing is this guided plan.
Okay.
But when they go to work with the students, they do have a specific lesson plan.
Okay.
Yep. And I think it's very similar to other lesson plans that are kind of based around explicit instruction.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Paula, I wanted to ask you, what are the ahas the students have when they engage in the phase 1 activity where they're really doing something that they've often done themselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, that in part that it is actually something that they don't even think about anymore, actually does have quite a few steps. And that just because they are very fluent at it and very good at it doesn't mean that those steps shouldn't be, pulled apart and broken down a little bit. One thing I have noticed a lot, and to be honest, Joe and I haven't talked that much about the examples and non-examples, but we did see when we would ask them to come up with, an example or a non-example, like what's an example of a really well-packed lunch, or what's a non-example? We'd ask them to do that. Sometimes as we were watching their instruction, the examples seemed to be a little off base from what we had initially shared as the criteria, So we actually added that sentence in there about why did you choose that example or non-example? Because the things like that little piece of the instruction is actually really important to the learner. And if you don't give it a lot of thought, I think sometimes students will sort of haphazardly, or teachers will sort of haphazardly pick an example or non-example, and it actually doesn't connect to the lesson at all.
Mm-hmm.
So
it gives them the chance to also be thoughtful about the importance of in planning where you use examples and non-examples, because sometimes they think they can do that on the fly, but it really is helpful to have thought about that in advance. So it sounds like you're modeling that for them as they transfer that over to their instruction.
Exactly. That was the big aha, is that to them, that was just like an item on a checklist. Oh yeah, here's an example. But they realized that, it actually matters. And yeah, that sometimes they'd come up with something and be like, oh, that really didn't make sense. And so I think also the other question is about when we ask them to think like, okay, for this purpose, they don't have to take the next steps. Like they don't have to ask their peers, now you practice. We don't do that in this particular activity. We pretty much stop after the modeling. But we ask them to think about that, because another aha moment they'd have is that sometimes when they're building a lesson, the practice activity that they have in mind doesn't actually connect with what they just emphasized in the explanation and in the model. So this really helps them to start thinking about that these things really do need to be connected. So I would say those were a couple of the really big aha moments.
So Paula, you mentioned in the phase 2 activity to Beth that they have a lesson plan. Is it scripted out, or is it more like this? Or does it have some bullets about here's the content you have to teach?
So yeah, it's a little bit more scripted. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Because at that point, we know exactly what the content is going to be. Mm-hmm. So for example, in the case of the paraphrasing strategy or a summarizing strategy, that one is actually fairly easy to script out really well. When we have done things around phonemic awareness, we'd like to be even more prescriptive, but sometimes, children are at different places. And so we have to be a little bit more flexible, which I think, just means that the instructors have to have an even closer eye on the lesson plans to make sure that the candidates have chosen really good example words or word parts that are, focused on where the children are.
Paula, could the candidates use the guided planning checklist as a self-evaluation tool when they are completing their own lesson plans on either content that they're comfortable with or content when they're making their instruction? So, I look at the this list and it says, write your notes describing how to, in this example, pack a lunch, but I'm sure that could generalize to how to teach, phonemic awareness. What examples and non-examples do you use? Could that turn around and be like a checklist for the candidate to say, in my lesson plan, I have described the skill, I have provided examples and non-examples, I have thought about how those are relevant. Have you ever used it in that way, or is that an application that you think could be useful?
Yeah, we haven't used it that way, but I do think that's a great application. Yeah, I love that idea. I think the more opportunities we can give them to make these things a habit, the better off they'll be. So then we also have a rubric that we use as the peers are watching each other, as the students, our candidates are watching each other teach. And I want to mention my colleagues, Francis and Mark Olson at Oakland University, who worked on this one celled rubric for, they're doing a lot of HLP work on the general education side, and this is something they use quite frequently. And we like it because it simplified the process a little bit, at least for the purposes of these phase 1 and phase 2 activities, for sure, maybe even into phase 3. So they have an opportunity to kind of look for things that they see that are really good along these criteria, and as well as areas that might need some improvement. And then the last, oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, quick question. You mentioned that you give the peer candidates a script or a simulation, then they're asking questions, I assume, based on certain things you're giving them, right, to ask?
Right. So the script, that's, I think, reflected in this document here.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Ahead.
No, that's good. So it's a student profile. So we ask them to, in this case, represent a first grade student. Now, one thing we're really careful about, and this was after some discussion and things that we've learned, is that we purposefully tell them, don't alter your voice in any way. And the reason for that is that we don't want to do anything that would be considered, well, let me just say this. We want to make sure that children are being thought of in a really dignified way. So we ask them to just stay in their adult voice, but in every other way, be a first grade student. So then what we've done is broken down the student profile and attached some ideas for how students might react based on the instruction, the component of explicit instruction that's occurring. So under describing and explaining, what we're looking for from the candidate is, in this case, clear and logical steps and student-friendly language. So we're telling the peers who are playing the part of students, begin the lesson listening to the teacher. Begin the lesson engaging through choral response, as you're asked to. But if these things happen, then you're free to do. So if the steps are clear and logical, then we want them to just stay focused. If the steps are unclear or not logical, we want the students to say, I don't understand, or I'm confused. And so we've kind of given them direction across the various components of explicit instruction in how they should respond depending on what the teacher candidate is doing. So we've got that for describing and explaining, and then a little bit on modeling, or the think aloud, and whoops, I guess that's the last slide. And then there's actually a page 2, which goes into components of modeling a little bit more, and what we would expect to see, so that the candidates who are playing the role of the student know how to respond to the instruction.
Does the candidate that's presenting the lesson, are they aware that they're acting like first grade students? Or
They are. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Because eventually they all play the part.
Okay.
So, yeah. Yep. And so, so this is then the same process is repeated when we get into phase 2, and it's just directed toward the actual content that they're going to be teaching. And then we move into phase 3 when we go to the school and they begin working with the students.
So do you, does does the instructor dictate the content that they're using, or can the student pick any kind of content they want?
The student, they do not get to pick. The school district dictates the content. I mean, we work with them ahead of time. We kind of negotiate this. So it's a great relationship. You know, we say, here are the things that we really feel like teacher candidates need to practice, and they're educators, so they know.
Right.
More often than not, completely agree. And so then it's just a matter of, you know, given the time in the semester, the hours of the day, that type of thing, are there classrooms that we can work with? And if so, what works best for those teachers?
How have you seen your candidates change? Like, for example, prior to using this stepwise process, have you noticed the candidates are more prepared for feedback? Have you noticed they're more prepared to develop in effective instruction? Like, what has the impact of this process been on your students and their quality?
Yeah, well, Dave, for sure, we hear so much positive feedback from them about the feedback that they received. They love the critical feedback. Now, we do have some who are kind of taken aback, like they're not accustomed to critical feedback, but for the most part, I think it helps them just because they're all doing it and they're all seeing it. And as the instructors, we do this first, like we stand up in front of them and we practice and we take feedback from them. So that's been one really, I think, really positive thing, is that they're starting to get accustomed to people giving them feedback for the sake of improving their instruction, which I think is huge. But then also that focus on the technical aspects of teaching, and that they feel like they will say, now I feel like I know how to do this. Kind of knew what I was supposed to teach, but I just didn't know how. I used to, my first year as the director of teacher education, I had 2 different occasions. One, they were both elementary teachers, but I'll never forget the one in particular. He came into my office and was talking about job searching, and said he was just finished his elementary program. And he said he didn't want to teach below 4th or 5th grade. He'd completed our program and felt like the reason was that he didn't think he knew how to teach kids how to read.
Wow.
And so I think that, I think that was a kind of a common feeling. Like I think our candidates, and I'm not just saying this isn't program specific. I think this is a problem across
all
the
over.
field.
Yeah.
Right. They feel like I have a sense for the what, I just don't know how to do this. And so we're focusing on the how, and it is a confidence booster for them. And they also can see the impact of some pretty subtle changes to the instruction that they're giving, because it is so targeted, you know. And I think that's also very helpful, that they realize that in teaching, we can make minor adjustments and it will improve our craft and our work. So yeah, that's what we're hoping.
Agreed.
Yeah, are there any other questions, feedback, comments?
I think this is amazing.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dave. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, do you have a formal process that the candidates provide, like a evaluation of this process? Like, it's obviously it's embedded in their coursework, but do you ever get any formal feedback from them about how they feel like this impacts their ability or impacts their practice?
We do. We get the end of the semester feedback from them, and they also have to write in their final exam. They do write a bit about the growth and development of their students, but mostly it is that end of the semester feedback. And you know, they could talk about a whole host of things about the course, but overwhelmingly, this is what they talk about.
So
Paula, oh, I'm sorry, Beth.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Mary.
I wondered, Paula, if you were able to record growth as they move from, you know, packing a lunch to then teaching the content to their fellow teacher candidate peers, and then moving to teaching the content in the tutoring part phase that you have as part of that initial coursework?
Mhm. I think, I think that's where the use of video, more video would be even more helpful. Because right now, what we largely do is collect some baseline around their teaching skills. And then once they get into the practicum experience is where we really have the comparative video, But I do think the places along the way would also be helpful. What we do have is when we use the rubric, those get turned in. And so we can analyze some of that feedback. The hesitation I have about using that data is that what's on the rubric has been written by their peers mostly. And so, I think this is a great question, and something I'd like to think a little bit more about, which is how can we, create some really good measures, but also have them be feasible given the number of students that we have. That's where that's what I think the struggle is the feasibility of collecting those. Because, I think about even in phase one, the reality is, I think it would be helpful to even do a second phase one. But we just don't have the time to do that. And so we're still, even within phase two on content, we're still intervening on their enactment of the practice as well.
Maybe when you finish, we could talk a little bit about that, because I had an idea based on what you already do.
Great. Yeah,
So
that
Paula,
would be wonderful.
I purely teach online, so my students are all in a virtual setting. And I know obviously with our current situation with COVID, more and more people are going to be teaching online. Is this something that you could see transferring to an online setting?
Yeah, I do. I really do. I think the challenge will be the phase three in an online setting, but I think the first two, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, and actually recording in those cases is probably even easier.
Yes, yes.
This is awesome. Super exciting. I think we're going to get a lot of people are going to appreciate this information and thinking about supporting their candidates in this way. I know I will for sure.
Yeah,
Thank you. Well, it's been a great experience really having to think about it this way, because it's helped us get a lot clearer.
Yeah, and it really takes you, Paula. I love it how it's that, it fills that gap between knowledge and implementation, and it scaffolds, up to where they're fully implementing on their own. So it's that in-between practice that they need.
Yeah, right.
The scaffolding part is what I think is so important, because I don't know about all of you, but I often forget what it's like to be a novice and how much novices really do not understand things that we talk about in class. Even after we model it, they believe they understand, but then when they go to do things, of course, doing something is so much different than the picture you have in your mind of what it's like to do.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that's what I think is so fascinating about it.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of forgotten what it feels like to be doing these things for the first few times. That high level of anxiety. Yeah.
And just not really knowing what to expect from children. Whereas when you've done something a lot, you really have a sense of how children will respond. You probably pick better examples because of it. You do things almost instinctively because you've collected so much information in your head about the students. I was thinking with the rubric, that you have, you it could be even as simple as just looking to see at first, how do students start to incorporate more and more of these behaviors into their practice over time.
Yeah, that's true.
And maybe for the instructors, like if you wanted to spot check with students just to see, is the activity improving growth in the way we want it to, like I could see this being really helpful for accreditation. Even just having maybe like a 1, 2, 3 rating scale, fully implemented as a 3, partially implemented as a 2. I don't know if it would work for all of this. Some of them may be kind of a yes or no. They either did it or they didn't. But you could play around with that and even see if students are able to begin to rate themselves in ways that are more aligned with how the instructor would see them, because that would have to, I would think, contribute to their ability to teach.
Yeah.
The better they are at seeing there's this things that they do well in their lesson and the areas they need to continue to work on, I think would improve their ability to analyze and reflect on their teaching and improve it. But maybe even the classroom teachers would be willing to do it if it was super simple like that.
Yeah.
But there's something to be said for that self-evaluation component, Mary, because I think that's one of the things that I see our candidates struggle with when they transition from like the first couple practical experiences where they're getting so much feedback, even though sometimes it's hard for them to kind of like accept all the feedback, but they become accustomed to it and they appreciate it. But then when they're in their student teaching, they might not get as much feedback, and they are looking for an external source to help them know whether they were effective or whether their instruction aligned with their actual teaching. So helping them have a mechanism to self-evaluate is probably a tool that will be helpful for them when they get into their induction phase, because they're not going to have that level of feedback all the time, and you wouldn't want that to stymie their development, their trajectory as they're moving forward in their induction years. So this process would be a way to help transition them from expecting external feedback to starting to identify and self-reflect.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and the video analysis, I think it's so much easier to self-reflect from a video than it is right after you actually do it. And there's so much going on in your head. If you can take a few days or a few moments to step back, and the video allows you to go back and forth. So having it recorded, I think, is really helpful.
Yep.
So Paula, can I ask, I'm not sure whether you said this already or not, but I know students, it's hard at first to become comfortable with feedback. And I was just wondering how you help students with that.
Yeah, we've talked about this quite a bit, because we do have some students who, no matter how the feedback is delivered, it's received as being really harsh.
Yeah.
And that's never the intention, but it is fair to say that some people are much more accustomed and welcoming of critique, at least at this stage of their careers, than others. And we could probably get into the psychology of that for all sorts of reasons. But I do think that it's really important for the instructors to, provide a little context around that, that we are going to be giving each other feedback and what to expect as far as your own personal reaction might be. And to maybe even have conversations in the class as a whole group about times in which they've received feedback and what that's felt like, and how they, maybe the manner in which they have appreciated feedback, or the manner in which they haven't always appreciated feedback, so that they're prepared to share, both share in a really, helpful way, but also open to being able to receive it because it's, yeah, don't imagine that it's a given that everyone will both accept feedback in the same way, but also deliver it in the same way.
Well, and that's such a good point, Paula. And one of the things that we've been working with our candidates on is for them to recognize all the places that they already are getting feedback. The candidates aren't, it's like when the children respond to you, that's feedback. When you get a call from a parent who is unclear about the homework, that's feedback. So
Very
it
true.
seems like their level of receptivity to that feedback is sometimes different than the feedback of here's the rubric and here's how you did or didn't do. So really helping them understand that the feedback sources are various and numerous and constant in your life as a teacher. I think that also has been an interesting way to help students be a little more comfortable with feedback, because once we have that conversation, they're like, oh my God, I've been getting feedback all this time and I never realized.
That is great. Thank you. I'd never thought about that way of talking about
Yeah.
all the other ways that they're getting it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Paula, do you have any last thoughts, or does anybody have any other questions they want to ask? Or
the thing that I think about a lot is I wish I had a lot of time, because I think that what I'd like to do is, or have others, think about, is how to take this kind of format and work with other practices in much the same way, because I think there's an opportunity to be really thoughtful about other HLPs and components of the HLPs that might also be served well with simulated interactions. And then on the other hand of that, I would also caution against too much, because they lose their power and impact when there's done all the time. So judicious choices around what we simulate and what we don't. That's something I've been thinking about quite a bit. In our state, we have adopted core practices. They are built into our new standards for beginner teachers. So we really have to make a shift toward a more practice-based approach to teacher education. So we're thinking about how to do this really well, and balance the amount of time we actually have with candidates with, what are the really critical needs that they have and the skills they need to have on the interclassrooms.
are they the sorts of core practices where inside of them you're able to talk about how this core practice might have to be changed, accommodated, enacted for students who have attention issues or who struggle with language? Or
yeah, it's definitely, they are at that level of complexity that there's room for teacher discretion and adjustments and accommodations. Yep.
that's terrific. So that gives you a place to talk about how are we going to practice teaching in ways for all learners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's
yeah, it's a big shift, but it's also really exciting.
it is. Well, I'm mindful of too just how much time, if you're going to teach well, is required both in the act of developing these kind of practice opportunities, but also the time it'll take to practice with candidates. And inevitably, you'll have to think about things that you're going to give up.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're able to show that candidates teach in ways that are more effective when they enter the classroom, then I think we can argue for why maybe we shouldn't have all those requirements in program approval, because they don't really take us to what we want from our teachers when they're beginners.
Right.
Yep. I just think about that a lot, like how hard it is really to teach somebody else to teach, but to learn to teach too.
Yeah, that's true. Mhm.
how much practice it takes. Well, if nobody else has any questions, Paula, I want to thank you for taking the time to record this.